Okay, I'm not sure what the sound's going to be like, but we'll have a go.
And we can have another take, can't we, if I
Of course.
lose track or forget
Yeah,
what I'm saying
absolutely
or
fine.
anything.
I have um, Ropes Hannah Cross with me to talk about the special issue that Rope are producing on women called African Women's Mobilizations, which is due out in September or October 2016. And I was just going to ask Hannah a few questions to tell us something about what's going to appear and some of the issues that come up in the special issue. So Hannah, could you just tell us something about the special issue, how it came about, what sort of articles are contained in it?
So the special issue has been in process for actually for a couple of years. It's based on a series of seminars in Paris, which were attended by Emmanuel Bouilly and Ophélie Rion. I met Emmanuel doing field work in Senegal, and she was doing research at the time with a women's organisation, a kind of collective who were responding to a crisis of migration where men were leaving their community to go towards Spain. So there was an association set up by bereaved mothers um, to try and mobilise, sensitise people about migration, and also come up with some practical solutions to their loss. So that has come into one of the articles, but there are also some much bigger themes which are addressed in the entire special issue. They all focus on ways that women organise, but what's particularly interesting about it is their range. So it's not simply social movements, but in some cases it's professional associations as well, advocacy groups, savings and income generating associations, but also we see how women participate in the struggle in the Niger Delta as well. And I think the point is really that it doesn't take this kind of approach of seeing women as heroes or victims. Instead, what the issue does very well is shed a lot of complexity on the relationship between women's movements and political economy and gender, and it brings these together very rigorously,
Excellent.
especially in the editorial.
Just my interest was immediately drawn to women in the Niger Delta. Is this a paper that looks at their involvement in some of the resistance movements that we've heard about?
Well, it's how they take on the role of militants, sometimes commanding forces. They don't only take the role of, reproducing, staying at home, but they also take all kinds of militant role, taking up arms, commanding people, strategizing. And it's Oriola, Temitope Oriola, who has this article, and he spent a lot of time interviewing them. So these were ex-combatants, and the title is "I Acted Like a Man," and it's what happens to gender roles when women go and join in the conflict. And the findings were really that when they've returned, there is a kind of stigma, that they have become men, they've lost their femininity, and they've kind of upset those gender roles. So one of the themes of the entire special issue is not only how gender roles influence women's movements, but also how those movements and different forms of mobilization affect gender roles, and also how they illustrate them. So it's not only looking at social reproduction, but also at different roles in society. And they might not be gender struggles explicitly, but be led by women. So the collective in Senegal is not. It's a women's movement, but it has a much broader community movement. And one of the questions there was, why are men not participating? And this is where intersectionality comes in, really, because that article illustrated very well not only sort of gender divisions, but also between age, that this movement tended to be run by mothers but not spouses. So this was actually a focus of a lot of research from anthropologists, people like Mayers, who they also talked about lineage, they talked about generations. And one of the interesting parts of this editorial is to bring that back and to talk about different intersections of power. So it's gender and age as well, but class is very much in the picture. And that's what I think one of the biggest lessons is, how it talks about class.
That's very interesting on intersectionality, and there's a very interesting and I think clear description of what you mean by the term in the introduction, and it's quite usefully mobilized as a clarifying tool. Could you say something a little bit more about, if you want, about intersectionality, but also about the French Marxist anthropologists that you've mentioned, and how do they make an appearance, and what do you think they lend to the special issue?
Okay, both of them are in a way my own projections, so that comes with a bit of a disclaimer. So first of all, when it comes to intersectionality, this is addressed very well in the editorial. It's one of the main themes. Hopefully we get to talk about the other themes as well.
Yeah.
But in talking about intersectionality, this is intersections of power. So it's how social mobilizations interlock with other systems of oppression. So there is kind of class oppression, and this is where things like the international and national elements come in, and how this influences grassroots social movements, but also different, various systems of oppression in women's lives. So that's how Emmanuel's put it in the editorial. So this is very important in the way that feminist theory does tend to be dominated by white and elite women and by the West. And I can talk about the way it speaks to me as someone who's not a gender specialist.
Yeah, do.
And this is as someone who teaches a lot of people who are very, very interested in gender, and they want to fight for gender rights. But I think there's been a very strong discourse in this country which really separates gender from class, and it has this very kind of flat approach by which, the UK or the West is kind of world leading in gender relations, and you measure that by things like the number of women in Parliament, but it becomes separated from class oppression. And without wanting to go on such a big tangent, there's another article in the special issue from Eileen Mary Tripp, which illustrates this very well, because she is looking at representation in parliaments in Africa. And you can see here that a lot of the preconceptions that people have are incorrect. Many African countries have very strong women's representation, Algeria, Senegal, a range of countries really. And she looks at how these quotas have been achieved. And a lot of this has happened by challenges within Parliament. So I think what's really interesting about this, again, from quite a selfish perspective, is that I think it really illustrates gender as well. Rather than saying let's fight for women, let's fight to have a female prime minister and a certain number of women in Parliament, to look a lot more closely at how this interlocks with class oppression, because that's completely been lost in the mainstream debate. And Brilliant. I think it's even been reversed.
Yeah.
So I want to say to students that if they forget these other systems of oppression, then talking about these rather shallow indicators of inclusivity is going to be very limited. And this almost goes back to the 1980s discourse, where it's women's equality to be exploited as much as men in some cases. So how do we look at this a lot more closely? How do we recognise what women are already doing in many parts of the world? That there is no world-leading place in gender relations, and it's certainly not the cradle of a capitalism that has created them in the first place.
Brilliant. Just a word, Hannah, on ROAPE's work that it's done in its history on women, because there've been a number of special issues on the role of women. Can you see, how do you see the significance of this really in terms of ROAPE's work more broadly?
Well, it picks up on ROAPE's work, so especially looking at former work by ROAPE, editors and friends, people like Janet Boudra, Caroline Bayliss, and they previously looked at these questions, and it's picking up on the old gender and class debates that again have largely been lost in the last 20 years and kind of reversed. But it's also picking up on and adding to social movement theory. So it's also unpacking a lot of that, and throwing up some really challenging questions, that challenge all of our kind of dogmatism and ideology sometimes, taking a very nuanced look at what happens when international organisations get involved in local struggles and the kind of challenges that they face.
So it's a contribution also to social movement theory.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So the theory that you've developed, along with people like Peter Dwyer. So looking at social movements, but then looking at women's activism, and this is not as a kind of annexed, what are women doing at the same time, but also, looking at how that influences social movements as a whole.
I'm aware that a number of studies are referenced in the introduction. The problem with some of them, including ones that I've contributed to, is that they neglect, shamefully in many ways, they would neglect these vital questions. So this, for me at least, seems like a vital contribution to that lacuna in social movement scholarship, which has blossomed to some extent.
I think it has a lot to say to that kind of scholarship as well. Yes, not just showing what women are doing at the same time, but also how this influences the political economy of protest. So it's another lens for understanding it.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, just before we run out of time, can I ask you a general question about ROAPE, separate from the special issue? Could you talk a little bit about your involvement in ROAPE and where you see, what contribution you see the journal making in terms of its contribution to radical political economy?
Okay, so that's a very general question. So I'm an editor of ROAPE, and I have been for a couple of years. I'm not going to repeat the remit because that's accessible on the website. But in terms of its contribution to scholarship, I think, like this special issue, we help to address some much bigger questions, and to challenge some of them. To challenge the rather flat, often binary approaches to politics that have kind of developed, and we are politically engaged, in any struggle, and this is really what we promote. So this is beside the special issue, but we have another article which is our prize winner for the year. And this is about, there's going to be an announcement in the special issue, but this is about the women of Marikana and how they've contributed to not only labour relations, but again to the struggle. So it fits in with the theme, even though it was published earlier. And going. Okay, I've lost my train of thought.
No, I think it's a very significant article, and we talked about it a week ago.
We did,
at the EWG meeting, and it's incredibly, almost exquisite in its details and research. Involvement in looking at the role of women in mining communities in the run-up to Marikana, but women are actually mining, and how that has impacted on both the struggles that we saw take place in that strike wave in 2012, 13 and on. So it was a very significant contribution to the journal, and is an additional contribution to the special issue.
Yes, and I think where I was going with it was that we have these very rich empirical studies, and we can also help to, influence a broader understanding of the struggles that are happening around the world.
Yeah.
So this is where we're going with them, and it's getting that perfect balance.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Hannah.
Thank you.